What happens when an entire army runs out of food? When 3 million soldiers face starvation? Well, sawdust becomes bread and leather boots become a source of protein. These German soldiers weren't experimenting. They were starving. With supplies gone, anything that could be swallowed became food. Moldy crusts, frozen horse meat, tree bark. This wasn't a meal. It was survival in its bleakest form. Long before scientists stepped in, hunger had already turned war into something even darker. Initially, everything seemed under control, until it wasn't. The army slipped, step by step, into hunger. Here's where the slow decline begins. It was June 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union expecting to finish by Christmas. They carried standard field rations that had worked in earlier campaigns. At first, the daily spread felt fulfilling and tasteful. This included canned meat known as Dosenfleisch, sliding from its tin and browning into a savory slice, followed by the biscuits, firm and faintly sweet, made to soften in a hot mug, and a tin of instant coffee, sending up a roasted curl of steam at dawn. And finally, the Erbwurst, the pea and bacon roll, dissolving into thick, smoky comfort. For a brief window, this parade of tins, blocks, rolls, and loaves still whispered the same promise. The system is working. Keep going. Weeks passed, then months. The sheer distance of the Eastern Front stretched every supply route thin. On top of that came accumulating blows to logistics. Soviet demolition teams blew rail lines. Bridges were lost. Fuel stocks reduced. A frontline soldier needed roughly 3,300 calories a day. By late 1942, many units were down to perhaps 2/3 of that, an everyday deficit that could not be made up later. Supply officers asked, how do we keep millions fed? Those small reductions solidified into daily hunger. Improvisation began. Substitutes multiplied. Ersatz stopped being a bureaucratic label and became the daily routine of these soldiers. Yet up to this point, the soldiers' field rations were still being supplemented by mobile field kitchens, known as Gulaschkanonen, so nicknamed for their cannon-like chimney and the goulash-style stews they ladled out. Let's step inside that kitchen scene while it still works, right before its support begins to fail. In the early months, the mobile field kitchens rolled up trailing steam. The camp smelled of onions, smoked meat, broth, and hot iron. Men lined up with mess tins, still believing the army's stomach was unbreakable. For the first comfort, hit the tins. Urban Suppe mit Speck, pea soup with bacon, rolled in thick and smoky, dried peas swelling beside potatoes. Onions and chunks of salty fat. Right after came Linsenetopf, a lentil stew where lentils, carrots, and potatoes soaked up to broth while a coin-thin slice of sausage melted away, leaving only its flavor. Then the mood sharpened with sauerkraut mit Wurst, sour cabbage tamed by hot, greasy sausage. Following that was Bohnen mit Speck, beans and bacon. Starchy, salty, pure fuel that sat heavy in a good way. And topping the lineup was the crowd favorite, goulash. Beef or pork cubes surrendered to a long simmer with onions and paprika, while potatoes or noodles drank in the red gravy. Back in all of it was Kommissbrot, still honest then, dark, sour, springy. Soldiers spread thick slices with canned meat, lard, a smear of honey or marmalade from a parcel, or even wrapped a piece around chocolate to warm and soften the bar. They traded crust ends, cracked jokes, breathed white clouds into the cold, and for a brief, fragile moment, they tasted home. They had no idea how quickly that sense of normal would dissolve. However, the feeling of home held only because a little boost still slipped in the shape of small extras, just enough to convince them the system still worked. These little boosts that came through before shrinkage included bitter chocolate rations for a quick lift, as well as powdered milk porridge easing a cold dawn, along with barley and chicory-based coffee breathing almost real roast into the mug, sweetener tablets fizzing a brief imitation of sugar, and finally, an occasional schnapps or beer sip thawing a frozen hour. These weren't meals, but they stitched morale between the bowls of richer fare. When they began to vanish, first the schnapps, then the chocolate, finally even the coffee tasting thin, men felt the slide before their stomachs fully emptied. With morale props fading, the bowls themselves changed. Meat shrinking out of sight, starch swelling, and flavor draining into memory. Late 1941 through 1942, distance, mud, ice, counterattacks, and sabotage slowed everything that carried food forward. Kitchens arrived late, lighter, or not at all. The hearty stews disappeared. In their place came a meatless potato echo of goulash. Potatoes, browned onion, roasted flour base, tomato paste tint, a trace of paprika, structure without meat. Mashed potatoes with thin brown gravy filled the stomach, yet gave little staying power. The gravy was brown flour, scrap fat, and water. A barley and vegetable hot pot swollen with pearl grains and a few carrot or potato flecks expanded the belly. Then energy fell off a cliff an hour later. Even the once solid rye loaf arrived drier and sliced thinner. Quiet clues to shrinking grain quality and batch stretching. Mess tin talk shifted from, does it taste okay, to, how long until I'm hollow again? Flavor slid out of focus. Filling space became the job. Pride thinned like the weak gravy train. There was a limit to stretching. Past it, the food turned into imitation. Same labels, but hollow inside. A quiet slide from shortage to deprivation. Replacement logic now ruled the ration. The steam still rose, but what fed it had changed. The barley and chicory-based coffee that once counted as a morale extra was now the only brew. Real beans were gone. Sweetener tablets that had merely perked up a cup now stood in for the absent sugar, with their metallic edge no longer optional. Protein gaps forced recipes to mutate. More stretchers like potato, turnip, oats, thinner meat shreds, bone stock boiled down for body. Blood sausage showed up in an altered state. More blood, less muscle, dark, glossy, iron-heavy, sitting on the tin like a specimen instead of a meal. Rutabaga stew, watery, faintly sweet, and then bitter on the back of the tongue, shouldered potatoes aside. A feed route turned into frontline staple. Even the once solid rye loaf had a weakened twin now. The flour bulked out with potato starch. Cellulose, tree flour, coarse brand rumors even whispered about wood fiber, so the crumb turned fibrous, gassy, cramp-inducing. Jokes about wood bread did the usual frontline job. Cover discomfort with a grin. Cooking had basically become math. Volume times minimal calories equaled one more day holding a line. Every ersatz mouthful carried two things at once: a ghost memory of how the real version tasted, and a quiet warning that strength and morale were draining underneath. Ersatz could maybe stretch the clock, but it could not refill the tank. The moment ersatz stopped holding men upright, structure vanished. What followed wasn't meals, rather just scavenging for energy. Encirclements, frozen rail lines, ruined depots. Stalingrad most clearly pushed units past rations into bare survival. Frozen horse meat was shaved from stiff carcasses and boiled into thin gray broth. Half-thawed tendons were chewed rather than wasted. Moldy rye bread had been scraped off, then was scorched to fake safety. Leather belts, harness straps, horsehide were soaked and boiled again and again. Boot soup to pull out the slightest gelatin. The rubbery strips were sometimes chopped into whatever root or weed scraps men had, just to make the pot look fuller. In wrecked blocks and pockets, cats called daches were trapped, skinned, stewed. Civilians did it. Soldiers followed. The ground soon became a pantry. Men and starving civilians dug up wild roots, pulled nettles, and snatched weeds and bitter herbs, even more often in the collapsing months of 1944 and 45. Nettles lost sting after boiling. Roots were sometimes just scraped and eaten raw when there was no fuel. Whole meals shrank to boiled weeds, raw roots, or cabbage water. A few pale leaves turning in a tin cup. Tree bark was scraped, dried, ground, mixed into dough. Solid bread became stretched bread, then bark-laced survival slab. It filled a mouth, not a body. With official issues gone, scavenging slid into looting. Frozen cellar doors were pried open. Abandoned flats were stripped for preserves. Odd canned goods, even pet food tins. A single jar of jam or pickled beets could spark a brief surge of hope before hunger closed back in. Some tried to build a stew shape. bark meal, a shred of horse meat, wilted nettles, a sliver of boiled leather to pretend normal remained. Others simply pried, chewed, swallowed. Eating stopped being communal, became a mechanical reflex. Faces hollowed, uniforms hung loose, and the thoughts? They narrowed it to one order: find any calories. This collapse of food wasn't a side note. It was logistics failing in slow motion. Each downgrade, from real stews to stretched starch to bark and boiled leather, shadowed the Army's shrinking reach and fading momentum. Hunger didn't just weaken muscle. It crushed initiative, judgment, and morale. In the end, the tin cup told the same story the map did. Advance stalled and defeat closed in. So when we look back at what German soldiers ate, we're not just gawking at strange, horrific, and gross wartime foods. We're tracing how an army unraveled from the inside out. For many who survived, the taste of scorched moldy rye, rutabaga water, or boot soup never fully left. They fought bullets and frost, yes, but also the daily erosion of body and will. It's a chapter that shows how, in war, starvation can become a second front. If this opened your eyes to how food shaped the Eastern Front, stick around, like, subscribe, and we'll dig into more hidden stories behind battlefield rations and survival.